Jake Martinez slouched into the back row of Lecture Hall 7 with all the enthusiasm of someone heading to a root canal. The chairs weren't designed for human anatomy, which meant his knees were practically touching his chin. But hey, at least the university had tried. Sort of. The cushions were filled with what felt like dried seaweed and disappointment. Around him, the usual collection of Galactic University's finest specimens settled into their seats. There was Pip, a Fluvian who looked like someone had crossed a rabbit with a nervous breakdown, constantly twitching her nose and checking the exits. The Zephyrian delegation took up half a row, with their crystalline exoskeletons that chimed softly every time they moved, which was constantly because apparently sitting still wasn't in their species' programming. In the front row, as always, sat the Korthax students. 6-foot-tall lizard people with attitude problems and a tendency to hiss at anyone who scored higher than them on exams. They kept shooting glances back at Jake like he was some kind of cosmic joke that had wandered into their advanced xenobiology class by mistake. "Attention, class," Professor Veltarian clicked as he skittered into the room on his 6 chitinous legs. The Manthari academic was all business today, his compound eyes gleaming with what Jake had learned to recognize as barely contained intellectual superiority. His mandibles clacked together in that particular rhythm that meant he was about to drop some knowledge on the inferior minds before him. Today we embark upon a fascinating journey into the fundamental responses that govern all sapient life. Veltarian's voice carried that tone professors used when they thought they were about to blow everyone's minds with groundbreaking concepts. We shall examine the most primal, most universal of all biological imperatives, fear. And collective rustle went through the classroom, as various species shifted uncomfortably. Pip's ears flattened against her skull. Even the supposedly tough Korthax straightened up a little. Jake pulled out his tablet and opened a new document. Another day, another lecture about universal biological truths that somehow always seemed to forget humans existed until they became inconvenient examples. "Fear, my dear students, is the great equalizer," Veltari continued, warming to his theme. "From the smallest Zephyrian crystalmite to the mightiest Draconic Empire warriors, all species share this fundamental response to danger. It is what kept our ancestors alive long enough to evolve into the sophisticated beings we are today." The professor's gaze swept across the room and landed on Jake for just a moment. There was something almost pitying in those multifaceted eyes, like he was looking at a particularly slow student who hadn't quite grasped the obvious. "Today we will conduct a practical demonstration of fear responses across multiple species. You will observe firsthand how evolution has shaped our most basic survival instincts." Veltari rubbed his front legs together in anticipation. "By the end of this class, you will understand why fear is truly the most honest emotion in the universe." Jake typed "Fear Response Demo Day 47 of Prof V thinking he invented biology" into his notes and settled back into his uncomfortable chair. Outside the massive viewport that dominated one wall of the lecture hall, the twin suns of the Centauri system painted everything in shades of gold and amber. It was actually pretty nice, as views went. He had a feeling this was going to be a long class. Professor Veltarian scuttled over to what looked like the galaxy's most over-engineered projector. The thing was roughly the size of a small shuttle and covered in enough blinking lights to give someone a seizure. Apparently, when you wanted to scare multiple species simultaneously, you needed some serious hardware. "Behold, the MC7 Psychological Response Stimulator," he announced, caressing the machine like it was his favorite pet. "Capable of generating holographic scenarios calibrated to trigger primal fear responses across over 200 known species." Jake glanced around the room. His fellow students had gone from mildly interested to visibly nervous. Pip had actually started hyperventilating, and the demonstration hadn't even begun yet. The Korthoks were trying to look tough, but their tail spikes were definitely more rigid than usual. "Let us begin with something simple," Veltarian said, his mandibles clicking in what Jake had learned was the Manchari equivalent of a smile. "Computer, initiate scenario Alpha 7, Apex Predator Encounter, standard Savannah setting." The lights dimmed, and suddenly the classroom was gone. In its place stretched an endless grassland under a blood-red sky. The air shimmered with heat, and somewhere in the distance, something roared. It was the kind of roar that made your bones vibrate, and your ancestors whisper warnings from beyond the grave. Pip squeaked and dove under her desk. The sound was honestly kind of adorable, like a squeaky toy being stepped on by a giant robot. The grassland erupted as something massive burst from cover. It looked like someone had taken a saber-toothed tiger, fed it nothing but steroids and bad intentions for about 1,000,000 years, then given it anger management issues. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, and its fangs were longer than Jake's forearm. The holographic beast let out another roar and charged straight toward the class. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The Zephyrian's crystals chimed in panic, creating a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Two of the Korthax actually hissed and backed against the wall, their tough guy facade evaporating faster than water on a hot sidewalk. Even some of the bigger, supposedly scarier species were showing obvious stress responses. Professor Valterian watched with the satisfaction of someone whose thesis was being proven in real time. His compound eyes swiveled to monitor each student's reaction, cataloging their responses like a cosmic bingo game. Thence he looked at Jake. Jake was still typing notes. He paused to take a sip from his water bottle, glanced up at the charging Megatiger, and went back to his tablet. His expression was about as exciting as someone watching paint dry in slow motion. "Fascinating," Jake muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "The muscle structure suggests a pursuit predator, but the fang development indicates more of an ambush strategy. Bit of evolutionary inconsistency there." The professor's antennae twitched. That wasn't exactly the response he'd programmed the scenario to produce. "Computer, escalate to Scenario Beta 3, Natural Disaster Protocol." The savannah vanished, replaced by a world coming apart at the seams. Earthquakes split the ground into gaping chasms that glowed with molten fire. Tornadoes the size of skyscrapers tore across the landscape, while overhead asteroids screamed down from a sky that looked like the universe was having a temper tantrum. The class's panic level went from mildly concerned to, "Someone please call our mothers." Pip was now completely under her desk, making small whimpering sounds. The Korthax had formed a defensive huddle, their earlier bravado completely forgotten. Jake looked up from his notes, watched a building-sized chunk of rock smash into the ground about 50 feet away, and nodded approvingly. "Nice particle effects," he said, then went back to typing. "Though the physics on that tornado are a bit off. Wind speeds that high wouldn't maintain that kind of structural integrity at the base." Professor Valterian's compound eyes were starting to twitch. Professor Valterian stared at Jake like he was a broken piece of equipment that refused to follow its programming. Around the classroom, his other students were displaying textbook fear responses. Pip had achieved what could only be described as peak rabid panic, complete with trembling whiskers and eyes the size of dinner plates. The Zephyrians were chiming so frantically they sounded like a carillon being played by someone having a seizure. Even the Korthax had dropped their tough guy act and were huddled together like scaly kindergartners during a thunderstorm. And there sat the human, calmly typing away like he was reviewing a grocery list. "Computer," Valterian said, his voice tight with academic frustration. "Initiate Scenario Gamma 9, Cosmic Horror, Existential Dread Protocol." The disaster-torn landscape melted away, replaced by the cold vacuum of space. But this wasn't the peaceful star-filled void of astronomy textbooks. This was space with attitude problems. Massive tentacles writhed between distant galaxies, each one larger than entire solar systems. Eyes the size of planets opened in the darkness, their gaze promising madness and the kind of knowledge that made philosophers retire early. Something that definitely shouldn't exist began singing in harmonics that made reality itself seem negotiable. The song bypassed the ears entirely and went straight for the part of the brain that handled existential terror and mortgage payments. The class completely lost it. Pip had transcended normal panic and achieved some kind of enlightened state of pure fear. She was making sounds that didn't seem possible for her species, like a tea kettle trying to summon ancient gods. The Zephyrians' crystal bodies were vibrating so hard they were creating their own light show, while the Korthax had given up all pretense of dignity and were actively whimpering. One of the Draconic students, who'd spent the entire semester bragging about his warrior lineage and battle scars, was now curled in a corner, reciting what sounded suspiciously like prayers to his ancestors. Jake glanced up at the cosmic nightmare unfolding above his head, watched a tentacle the size of the Milky Way casually rearrange a few nebulae, and made a thoughtful humming sound. "You know," he said conversationally, "this reminds me of that Lovecraft collection I read in high school, though I have to say, Cthulhu had better character development." The professor's mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like castanets being played by a caffeinated flamenco dancer. "Computer, override safety protocols, access restricted scenario files, authorization Valterian 7-7 Alpha." A warning klaxon sounded, and red lights began flashing around the classroom. Even through their terror, several students managed to look concerned. Restricted scenarios weren't called restricted because they were mildly uncomfortable. "Professor," squeaked one of the Zephyrins between panicked chimes, "are you certain this is wise? Those files are classified for psychological warfare applications." Valterian wasn't listening. His academic pride was on the line here. Somewhere in his insectoid brain, the fundamental principles of xenobiology were being challenged by one impossibly calm human who seemed to treat universal terror responses like a mildly interesting nature documentary. "Computer, initiate scenario Omega-1, Apex Fear Response Matrix, all species, maximum intensity." The cosmic horror vanished, and for a moment blessed normalcy returned to the classroom. Then, the real nightmare began. The holographic system didn't just project one scary scenario. It projected every scary scenario, customized for each individual species in the room. Pip found herself face to face with a pack of her species' ancient predators, massive hawk-like creatures with beaks that could crack titanium. The Korthax were suddenly surrounded by their racial nemesis, the crystalline void hunters that had nearly driven them to extinction centuries ago. But the system didn't stop there. It analyzed each student's individual psychological profile and crafted personalized horrors. The draconic student's warrior ancestors appeared, shaking their heads in disappointment at his cowardice. The Zephyrians were trapped in scenarios where their crystal bodies were slowly cracking and going dark. The classroom became a symphony of species-specific terror. Every possible fear response was on display, from the biological to the psychological to the deeply personal. It was like a museum of panic, curated by a mad scientist with a psychology degree. Professor Valterian watched his sensors go crazy as stress hormones spiked across dozens of different physiologies. Heart rates that could power small cities, adrenaline levels that could fuel starships, fear pheromones that were probably violating several atmospheric safety regulations. Then he looked at Jake's readings. Heart rate, steady. Blood pressure, normal. Stress hormones, practically non-existent. Brain activity, focused and analytical, like someone working through a particularly interesting crossword puzzle. Jake looked around the chaos-filled classroom, taking in the personalized nightmares with the detached interest of an art critic at a gallery opening. "Ha," he said, pulling out his phone. "Mind if I record this? My little sister would love this. She's really into special effects." The professor made a sound that no Manthari throat was designed to produce. It was somewhere between a scream, a mechanical failure, and the death cry of his doctoral thesis. Professor Valterian had officially entered what humans might call full mad scientist mode. His compound eyes were twitching in patterns that probably violated several laws of physics, and his mandibles were clicking out what sounded like a frantic Morse code message to the universe asking why his life had gone so wrong. "Computer," he said, his voice taking on the dangerous calm of someone who'd decided that academic ethics were more like academic suggestions. "Access the Psychological Warfare Archive. Authorization. Emergency Research Override. Valtarian Omega-9. A new voice joined the conversation, crisp and mechanical with just a hint of concern that even the AI seemed worried about where this was going. "Warning. Psychological Warfare Archive contains scenarios designed for military interrogation and enemy demoralization. These simulations may cause permanent psychological damage. Please confirm authorization." Around the classroom, the few students who weren't completely catatonic with terror managed to look even more terrified, which was honestly impressive given the circumstances. Pip had achieved some kind of transcendent state of panic that might actually qualify as a religious experience. The cortex had given up on maintaining any dignity and were now making sounds like deflating bagpipes filled with regret. "Authorization confirmed," Valterian shrieked, his scientific objectivity having packed its bags and left for a nice vacation somewhere far away from this mess. "Computer, analyze human subject Jake Martinez, full psychological profile. Deploy counter-specile fear response protocols based on Earth evolutionary history. Maximum intensity, no safety limiters." The classroom fell silent for a moment as the computer processed this request. Even the ongoing holographic nightmares seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was taking a moment to say, "Are you sure about this?" Then it began. The personalized terrors vanished, replaced by something that made the previous scenarios look like children's bedtime stories. The classroom transformed into a primordial Earth landscape, back when the planet was basically a horror movie with geological features. Massive shapes moved through prehistoric forests that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of sadistic botanists. Saber-toothed cats the size of small buildings prowled between trees that could crush starships. Giant bears that made the previous holo-tigers look like house pets, emerged from caves that seemed to lead directly to the planet's molten core. But the computer wasn't done. It had analyzed human evolutionary history and decided to throw everything Earth had ever produced to kill, maim, or generally inconvenience early humans. Giant spiders dropped from trees on silk strands thick as cables. Massive crocodiles lurked in rivers that boiled with prehistoric fury. Pack hunters with intelligence gleaming in their eyes coordinated attacks with the tactical precision of military units. The sky filled with pterodactyls that had clearly been hitting the gym since the Mesozoic era, their wingspans blotting out the sun as they screamed challenges that could shatter stone. The ground shook as something that might have been a T-Rex, if T-Rexes had been designed by someone with serious anger management issues and access to performance-enhancing drugs, crashed through the forest. But the computer saved the best for last. It projected the ocean, and from its depths rose creatures that made cosmic horror look quaint. Giant squids with tentacles that could wrap around mountains. Sharks that had apparently decided regular shark wasn't scary enough, and had gone for the prehistoric nightmare fuel upgrade. And things with too many teeth and not enough regard for the natural order. The biometric sensors around Jake's desk were going absolutely crazy, trying to measure his response to humanity's greatest evolutionary challenges. The computer had essentially created a highlight reel of every single thing that had tried to eat, crush, poison, or otherwise inconvenience humans for millions of years of evolution. Professor Veltarian watched the readings with the intensity of someone whose entire career hung in the balance. This was it. This was the scenario that would finally break the human. Every species had their breaking point, that primal fear buried so deep in their evolutionary memory that no amount of civilization could suppress it. The massive T-Rex thing lowered its head until it was level with Jake's desk. Its eyes, each one larger than Jake's entire body, focused on the human with predatory intelligence. It opened its mouth, revealing teeth like ivory tombstones, and let out a roar that should have liquefied Jake's internal organs from pure sonic terror. Jake looked up from his notes, made eye contact with the prehistoric nightmare, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a terrified rictus of fear. A genuine, pleased smile, like someone had just shown him something genuinely cool. "Oh wow," Jake said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who just discovered his favorite band had released a new album. "That's a really good T-Rex. The muscle definition is spot on, and you got the feather patterns right too. Most people still think they were all scales, but the latest fossil evidence suggests..." He paused, pulling out his phone again. "Sorry, do you mind if I get a selfie with this? My nephew is going through a dinosaur phase, and this would absolutely make his year." Professor Valtarian made a sound that no living creature should ever make. It was the sound of a worldview dying, of scientific principles being murdered in broad daylight, of an entire academic career being fed through a shredder made of human indifference. Jake held up his phone and grinned at the camera while a creature designed to represent millions of years of human evolutionary terror photobombed his selfie. The T-Rex, confused by this turn of events and lacking programming for dealing with enthusiastic tourists, actually seemed to pose a little. "This is awesome," Jake continued, apparently unaware that he'd just broken his professor's brain. "The resolution on this holographic system is incredible. You can see individual scales, the way the light hits the teeth, even the little details around the eyes. What kind of processing power does this thing have?" The professor's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his chair with the defeated posture of someone who just watched their life's work get body-slammed by a single human's complete inability to be appropriately terrified of anything. The holographic prehistoric nightmare flickered and died as Professor Valtarian apparently forgot how to operate his own equipment. The classroom returned to normal, though normal was relative when half the students were still recovering from what could generously be called the academic equivalent of psychological warfare. Pip had emerged from under her desk but was still twitching like someone had wired her nervous system to a particularly erratic electrical grid. The Cortex were slowly uncurling from their defensive huddles, their earlier swagger replaced by the shell-shocked expressions of warriors who'd just discovered that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Zephyrys had stopped their panic chiming, but their crystals were still flickering with residual terror energy. Into this atmosphere of collective trauma, Jake's voice cut through the silence with all the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. "So," he said, closing his tablet with a satisfied click, "that was fun. Though I have to say, you guys really need to work on your fear tolerance. That was, like, maybe a 6 out of 10 on the scary scale." The statement landed in the classroom like a conversational bomb. Several students turned to stare at Jake with expressions that suggested he'd just claimed that gravity was optional and mathematics was just a really elaborate prank. Zix, a crustacean-like being whose species had evolved from something that looked like a lobster crossed with a panic attack, slowly approached Jake's desk. His eye stalks swiveled nervously as he spoke, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to communicate with what might be either a god or a complete lunatic. "Jake," Zix said, his mandibles clicking uncertainly, "I must ask, how do you remain so calm during these scenarios? Are humans perhaps immune to fear responses? Do you lack the proper neurological structures? Have you suffered some kind of traumatic brain injury that affects your survival instincts?" Jake looked genuinely surprised by the question, like someone had just asked him to explain why water was wet. "Oh, I'm not fearless," he said with a laugh. "Trust me, I jump at plenty of stuff. You should see me when my roommate plays horror games at 3 in the morning. But this," he gestured at the now empty holographic projection area, "this is just like going to the movies." The confusion in the room was so thick you could practically cut it with a knife and serve it at dinner parties. "Movies?" squeaked Pip, her voice still shaky from her earlier ordeal. "Yeah, movies. Films. Visual entertainment." Jake pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. "We make these things called horror movies specifically to scare ourselves. For fun. Like, here." He held up his phone showing what appeared to be a promotional image from something called Jurassic Park. The image featured a massive T-Rex, remarkably similar to the one the computer had just projected, chasing what looked like humans in some kind of ground vehicle. "This one's about genetically engineered dinosaurs that escape and try to eat people. It was huge when it came out, spawned like 6 sequels. My dad took me to see the first one when I was 8. The classroom was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in a neighboring solar system." "You show images of apex predators to your children," stated one of the Draconic students, his voice flat with disbelief, "for entertainment." "Oh, that's nothing," Jake continued, completely missing the growing horror on his classmates' faces. "Wait until you hear about haunted houses. We literally pay money to have people jump out and scare us in dark buildings. And roller coasters. And bungee jumping, and free climbing, and horror video games." Zix's eye stalks were vibrating so fast they were becoming blurry. "Let me understand this correctly," he said slowly, like someone trying to process information that violated the fundamental laws of sanity. "Your species voluntarily exposes itself to fear-inducing stimuli as a recreational activity." "Pretty much, yeah." Jake was warming to the topic now, the way people do when they get to explain something they enjoy. "My little sister Lucy is 12, and her favorite thing is watching shark documentaries while eating dinner. She's got this whole collection of nature shows about things that could kill you. Deadliest animals, when predators attack, surviving the unsurvivable. She watches them the way other kids watch cartoons." Several students made sounds that might have been whimpering. "And extreme sports," Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was systematically destroying his classmates' understanding of rational behavior. "People jump off mountains with nothing but fabric wings. They surf waves that could crush buildings. They race vehicles at speeds that would liquefy most species. They climb vertical rock faces without ropes just to see if they can." "But why?" The question came from somewhere in the back of the room, voiced with the desperate confusion of someone whose worldview was currently being fed through a blender. Jake paused, considering the question with the seriousness of someone being asked to explain the meaning of life. "Because it's exciting, I guess. The adrenaline rush, the challenge, the feeling of pushing your limits," he shrugged. "Plus, when you know it's not real danger or controlled danger, fear kind of becomes fun. It's like your body's way of reminding you that you're alive." The silence that followed this explanation was the kind of silence usually reserved for libraries, funeral homes, and moments when entire civilizations realize they've been thinking about something completely wrong for their entire existence. Professor Valterian, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout this revelation, slowly raised his head. His compound eyes focused on Jake with the expression of someone who'd just realized that everything they thought they knew about the universe was actually just the opening chapter of a much stranger book. "You're telling me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that humans have weaponized fear into entertainment?" Jake grinned. "Pretty much. Want me to bring some movies for next class? I've got a great collection of zombie films that might really expand your understanding of human recreational terror." Professor Valterian stared at Jake for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting the kind of existential crisis usually reserved for philosophers who'd just discovered that free will was actually a subscription service. His entire academic career, built on the foundation that fear was the great universal constant, was currently being demolished by one human who treated terror like a hobby. "My theses," he whispered, his voice carrying the broken dreams of someone who'd just watched their life's work get turned into confetti. "My research. 23 years of documenting universal fear responses across 417 species." Jake looked genuinely sympathetic, which somehow made everything worse. "Oh, hey. Don't worry about it," he said with the cheerful optimism of someone who didn't realize he'd just committed academic homicide. "Science is all about updating theories when you get new data, right? I mean, you've still got solid research on 416 species. That's not bad." The professor's mandibles began clicking in what could charitably be called a rhythm, if rhythm could have a nervous breakdown and develop anxiety issues. But the paper was titled Universal Fear Responses, the Galactic Constant That Binds All Sapient Life. Valtarian said, his voice climbing toward frequencies that probably violated noise ordinances. "The word universal is right there in the title. How is it universal if humans just sit there taking notes and asking for selfies?" Jake considered this with the thoughtfulness of someone being asked to solve a particularly interesting puzzle. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe the problem isn't with your research. Maybe it's with the word universal. I mean, when you really think about it, the only universal constant is that every species is different, right? Like, you guys all have these amazing fear responses because that's what kept your ancestors alive. But humans, we kind of went a different route." He gestured vaguely, as if the entire concept of human evolutionary psychology could be summed up with a casual wave. "See, our ancestors were pretty much the galaxy's least impressive predators for most of our evolution. We couldn't outrun anything, couldn't outfight anything, couldn't outhide anything. So instead, we got really, really good at being too stubborn to die. When something scared us, we didn't just run away and never come back. We came back with bigger sticks, better plans, and usually some friends." The classroom was listening with the rapt attention usually reserved for religious revelations or traffic accidents. "Eventually, we got so good at dealing with scary things that we ran out of naturally occurring scary things to deal with. So we started making our own." Jake's grin widened. "Horror movies, extreme sports, haunted houses, roller coasters. We turned fear into entertainment because we missed having something to be appropriately terrified of." Zix's eye stalks had stopped moving entirely. He was staring at Jake like someone had just explained that mathematics was actually just really advanced finger painting. "You're saying," Zix said carefully, "that humans became so proficient at overcoming fear that you had to artificially recreate it for recreational purposes." "Exactly," Jake said, pleased that someone was finally getting it. "It's like how some people collect stamps, except instead of stamps, we collect ways to make our hearts race and our adrenaline spike. My cousin does something called free solo rock climbing, which is basically climbing 1,000-foot cliffs without any safety equipment, just because the possibility of falling makes it more exciting." Professor Valtarian had gone very, very still, the kind of still that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological collapse. "Humans," he said slowly, "have domesticated terror." "I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of weird," Jake admitted. "But yeah, basically. We took our worst fears and turned them into weekend activities." The professor sat in silence for several long moments, his compound eyes unfocused as he processed this information. Around the classroom, students were slowly emerging from their various states of trauma-induced paralysis, though most of them were now staring at Jake like he was some kind of cosmic anomaly that had wandered into their orderly universe. Then, slowly, Professor Valtarian began to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone whose mind had just snapped like an overtensioned violin string. The laugh of an academic who discovered that the universe had a sense of humor, and it was apparently aimed directly at his research. "You know what?" he said, his voice taking on the slightly unhinged quality of someone who'd decided to embrace chaos rather than fight it. "You're absolutely right. This is fascinating. Terrifying, but fascinating." He stood up, his legs slightly unsteady, and began pacing around the front of the classroom with the manic energy of someone who just had a revelation that might be either brilliant or completely insane. "We've been approaching this all wrong," he continued, his mandibles clicking with renewed enthusiasm. "Instead of studying fear responses, we should be studying excitement responses. Thrill-seeking behavior, the neurological mechanisms that allow a species to transform terror into entertainment." Jake nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like a human. Though I should probably warn you, if you really want to understand human psychology, you're going to need to study some pretty weird stuff. like people who voluntarily watch movies about clowns, or individuals who think camping in bear country is a relaxing vacation. Yes, Veltarian said, his eyes gleaming with the dangerous light of academic inspiration. Yes, I can restructure the entire curriculum around this concept. Fear as adaptive response versus fear as recreational stimulus. The psychology of voluntary terror exposure. The evolutionary advantages of adrenaline addiction. He turned to face the class, who were all still looking like they'd been collectively hit by a truck full of existential confusion. Class dismissed, he announced. I have approximately 17 years of research to completely rewrite, and a new paper to draft titled, Why Humans Are Probably Insane, a Xenobiological Analysis of Recreational Terror Consumption. As students began filing out of the classroom with the shell-shocked expressions of trauma survivors, Jake packed up his things with the satisfied air of someone who'd just had a productive day at school. Oh, Professor, he called out as he headed for the door, I meant what I said about bringing some movies next week. I've got this great collection of zombie films, and there's this one called The Thing that's basically about paranoia and isolation in extreme conditions. Might give you some ideas for your new research direction. Professor Veltarian looked up from where he was frantically scribbling notes about recreational fear, consumption patterns, and adaptive terror domestication. Zombie films, he asked, his voice carrying the careful curiosity of someone who'd learned to expect the impossible from humans. Oh yeah, Jake said cheerfully. Dead things that come back to eat the living. Classic human entertainment. Lucy's got the whole series. She watches them while doing homework. As Jake left the classroom, Professor Veltarian sat alone among his scattered research notes, slowly coming to terms with the fact that somewhere in the galaxy there was a 12-year-old human girl who did her math homework while watching the animated corpses of her own species try to devour the living, and apparently found this combination both educational and relaxing. He made a note to schedule a very long conversation with the university's mental health department. Not for himself, though that might not be a bad idea either. He needed to understand how an entire species had managed to evolve past the point where survival instincts made sense. Outside the classroom, Jake checked his schedule and headed toward his next class, Advanced Quantum Mechanics with Professor Thaklon. He was actually looking forward to it. Yesterday they'd covered parallel universe theory, and Jake was curious to see if any of the alternate realities featured humans who were afraid of reasonable things, like tax audits and student loan debt, instead of treating prehistoric monster movies as family bonding time.